Yan. Magandang araw. Today we're gonna discuss another topic on national security as part of your modules for Nstp this semester. So I guess we can start right away with this concept. There you go. Okay. So what is national security? For this discussion, that's the one question that we're going to probe, that we'll try to address, and what are the concerns or issues associated with this concept of national security. So to begin, when we think of national security, there has always been different approaches to defining national security. We start with the traditional approach to national security. And this approach to defining this concept is very much tied to the way the state and state power is conceived. Ika nga, kapag nababanggit sa atin yung usapin ng national security, ang unang pumapasok sa isip natin ay yung Estado, or to be more specific, actually, the government, right? But there are, of course, fine distinctions between state and government as a concept. Pero yun yung unang pumapasok sa isip natin, di ba? So, subukan natin magtanong-tanong, halimbawa, sa mga kapamilya natin ngayon, nakasama natin sa bahay, or mga kaibigan, kapitbahay. Para sa inyo, ano ang national security? And most certainly, ang una nilang isasagot dyan, militar, ang gobyerno, ang pangulo, bilang, the commander-in-chief. And so, that common notion about national security can be classified as a more traditional approach to defining this concept. Now, how do we understand national security in this way? We start with, again, the concept of the state, the concept which national security is tied with, right? And so, in order for us to understand this concept of the state, we have to define what state power is and what state structures mean, the kind of structures that we have right now. For example, you have the military structure, the bureaucracy, right? Of course, the three branches of government and other offices. So let's start with state power. And when we try to understand or explain what state power is, it's basically answering the question, why do we need a state, right? For us right now, it would seem a curious question, right? Why do we need a state? Kasi para sa atin na namulat sa isang lipunan na meron ng estado, it's normal, right? Parang we take it for granted na, okay, nandyan yung state, we need that for what? For security, national defense, maintaining order, peace, stability, di ba? Yun yung rhetoric lagi ng kahit na anong gobyerno at kahit na anong kahit na anong administrasyon ang nandyan sa estado poder, yun yung laging sinasabi. So for us, napaka commonsensical na, kumbaga, why do we need a state? It's for these reasons, right? But there used to be a time when this very question of why do we need a state is actually debated, and actually until now we were still debating, right? Why do we need a state? In the academe, right? We always debate this question: why do we need a state? And there are various theories, there are contending theories that try to explain why do we need a state. You can look at it from an anthropological standpoint, right? You can look at it from an economic standpoint, and theoretically there are contending views about this notion of state power. You would have the Marxists arguing that state power is basically class defined, right? In other words, state structures is being used as an instrument by the ruling classes of the bourgeoisie to perpetuate their rule against the working classes in any society. Parang ganun yung very crude na summary ng Marxist approach to the state power. And then of course we have the more conventional, at ito yung lagi nating may encounter, I think throughout your stay in the university, you would always hear this social contract theory, as an approach to understanding why do we need the state. And there have been different iterations of this theory. There have been different theorists even that forwarded their own notion of a social contract, beginning as early as the ancient Greeks to Thomas Hobbes, modern versions nito and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jean Locke, etc. Right? So what does the social contract theory means for yung pag-unawa doon sa konsepto ng state power? Well, according to the social contract theorists, bagamat nagtutunggali sila sa mga detalye ng kanilang theory, they all agree on the same principle na imagine if there's no state power at all. That situation, according to social contract theorists, is kind of like a state of nature where we as individuals are left to our own devices. Some social contract theorists would argue that in a state of nature, we have complete freedom, right, and perfect equality. Well, other social contract theorists would argue na as nice, as pleasing, as appealing as that might seem, right? Now we have perfect freedom, perfect equality. If you come to think about it, sabi nila, especially Thomas Hobbes, that actually is a very frightening situation, right? Kasi if we have perfect freedom, meaning we can do anything we want with impunity against each other, and we have perfect equality, of course, meron yung mas malakas talaga, meron yung mas matangkad, meron yung mas ang tawag dito, mas matalino or what have you, ang pakahulugan lang dito ng perfect equality is that all of us can do almost exactly the same thing against each other, meaning we can kill, maim, or do nasty things against each other in order for us to survive in that hypothetical state of nature where the state does not exist. In other words, sabi nila, if there's no state, then there would be disorder, anarchy, right? And to use Thomas Hobbes' description, the life of every human being would be solitary, nasty, brutish, diba? Short. Kasi nga, again, we're right on each other's necks. In other words, we are basically living in a dog-eat-dog world. So, ano yung sagot doon? Well, seeing that these individuals in the state of nature are also rational human beings, right? Assuming that they are rational human beings, they would eventually realize that this perfect freedom and perfect equality cannot be a basis for the survival of each and every one of them, cannot be the basis for survival of any sort of civilization or society. And so they would be compelled to come to an agreement, and this is now the social contract, to form a state, to transfer some of those freedoms to a higher power that is now the state, in order to ensure peace, instability, and order, in order for us to protect or to protect ourselves from each other, basically. So that's how the social contract theory would explain state power. That's how social contract theory would answer the question, why do we need the state? Okay, so to summarize, we need the state because we need to maintain peace and stability. Without a state, it's very much like the state of nature where anarchy reigns. Ganun yung pakahulugan nila. Of course, there are criticisms against this theory. Take note that yung state of nature yung notion, yung concept ng state of nature is it's actually hypothetical and it's not historical, bagamat may historical roots yun, ano, if you look into it. And meron din siyang parang ethnocentric at racist implications, ano, later on. Pero there have been criticisms, ano, but this is not the, I think this is not the venue for us to go deeper into the specifics, ano, and the criticisms of this theory. Pero that's one way of thinking about state power, ano. And eventually that has come to be the basis, ano, for the international system of states, ano. In a way, parang in-extend nila yung argument at a global level where okay, we need an international system of states governed by a supranational institution or supranational institutions like the United Nations, for instance, in order for these states to prevent, in order for these states to stop going against each other, or kumbaga to prevent wars, ano, against each other, or within a particular state, ano. So that's one way of thinking about state power, no? And again, that's the traditional way of looking at it. And so with that notion of state power, we now come to have a particular notion of how states should be structured, right? So for social contract theories, if you have that notion of the state as the very institution, the very structure that should maintain peace and stability, then you would have to construct political institutions, offices according to that goal, diba? And so from an organizational standpoint, if we look at our state structure, if we look at our national state structure, its functions is basically to maintain state survival from external threats and even, of course, internal threats, right? We always hear words like, aside from wars, you have terrorism, as threats. And so ganun yung naging itsura, ng mga estado over the years, and that's how national security has been defined, as a function of how state power was thought about, especially from a social contract standpoint. And so we always hear different rhetorics of military threats, and so kung yun yung laging kung ganun kino-construct ng estado, yung mga usapin kaugnay ng national security, then of course you would have the consequences would be you would have a very militaristic response then. Kasi if you tie your concept of national security with military threats, in order to ensure state survival, then the way you would address those concerns would be militaristic then. So just take, for example, yung mga the terms that our yung past administrations have used, so terms like state of calamity, right? State of emergency, martial law, diba? Always invoking or always calling out the military to ensure, diba? Any form or to maintain stability within the state. Okay, so that's the consequences of thinking about national security from this traditional approach, right? And so you now have a notion that national security is basically a prerequisite to national development. So we hear this invoked in policy circles being, for example, yung gulo sa ating bayan ang sanhi ng kahirapan. We have terroristic threats, we have threats from the communists, right, and the radical Islamists, yun yung lagi nilang ginagamit ng mga term, kaya daw napakahirap ng Pilipinas dahil sa mga yun, so kung ganun nila frame yung usapin ng national security, then almost always the response would be a very militaristic policy din. Diba? Kasi they framed it as a military problem. So national security has been defined in a traditional way, and so they frame all these problems as military problems, and so the way they address these problems is also militaristic. Kasi nga para sa kanila, in order for us to develop as a nation, we have to ensure national security. Contrary to the view, for example, of these groups who are waging protracted wars against the national government, as for example, the communists would argue that kaya mayroong digmaan ay dahil naghihirap yung sambayan ng Pilipino. Which is, di ba, parang kabaliktaran siya doon sa rhetoric ng Philippine state. Para sa Philippine state, mahirap ang Pilipinas dahil sa mga digmaang ito. Ang sasabihin naman ng mga komunista or ng iba pang mga grupo merong kahirapan, merong malawak na kahirapan, kaya nag-aalsa yung taong bayan at kaya may digmaan. So ganun yung tensions between these different conceptions of national security and how we should view national development. And this actually leads some scholars to develop a more holistic approach to national security and development. Instead of looking at it one-dimensionally, as a problem as a militaristic concern, sabi ng ibang scholars, we should look at national security in a more holistic way. And what do they mean by a more holistic approach to national security? So now they have developed different concepts, in order to expand that traditional notion of national security. So ang sabi nila, instead of using national security as a concept, why not we should use human security, for example, as an avenue, as a way for us to cultivate peace, for example, right, or to maintain peace and stability in the country. So from national security to human security. And there are different, or there have been various bases for developing this concept. So you have different international declarations, right? Even the Human Development Report, from the UNDP, have cited human security as a way of thinking about problems of stability and development in a particular country, instead of looking at it from a very traditional approach to national security. And what does this concept of human security entail? When we think of human security, one of the definitions of human security is basically looking at it as people's freedom from fear and freedom from want in a very broad sense. So how do we ensure that people have enough food on their table, right? How do we ensure that people are secure in their homes and in their persons? And so if we define human security that way, we are led to different dimensions of security. So dito na natin nakikita yung expansion ng concept ng security. From a very militaristic concept of national security, we now have an expanded concept of security, of human security, that include different dimensions like economic security. Right? Meron bang sapat na trabaho para sa bawat isa sa Pilipinas ngayon? At sa mga trabahong yon, meron bang kasiguruhan yung mga individual na kasiguruhan sa trabaho? Meron ba silang sapat na sahod? Meron ba silang karapatang mag-union sa kanilang mga pagawaan? So that's how we can think of economic security. Health security. Paano ba ang tamang approach pagdating sa usapin ng kalusugan? At lalo pa ngayon na meron tayong pandemya. Should we almost always rely on a more curative approach? So ibig sabihin tawag dito. Pag sinabi natin curative approach, ang tuon lagi ay yung parang medicalization ng bawat public health or any other health concerns. as opposed to preventive approach, where we look at health as a holistic concern. So again, babalik din siya, kaugnay din, pag tinignan natin yung health from a preventive approach, so mas community-based yung pagtackle sa mga problema, at kaugnay din siya doon sa iba pang mga dimensions dito, like economic, diba? So how do you ensure that each family have access to nutritious food? Well, they should have, access to ang tawag dito, dignified sources of living, ba? Hindi yung napipilitan lang silang kunin yung isang trabaho na kontraktual at napakaliit ng pasahod dahil wala na silang ibang makuhang trabaho. So again, magkakaugnay itong bawat isang dimension na ito, no? So personal security, maalala natin yung Bill of Rights, from our discussion on citizenship. Political security, do individuals have access to yung equal access to the justice system, right? Or do they have are they recognized as citizens in a way na parang kinikilala ba ang karapatan nilang bumoto, or yung kanilang karapatang maging bahagi ng pamamahala ng isang munisipalidad man yan o syudad, o barangay. So this is how we can think of political security in terms of political rights, civil and political rights. Food security. So dito rin kaugnay yung usapin ng climate change, and environmental security as well as community security. So again, that's how we can think of human security, as people's freedom from fear and freedom from want in a very broad sense. Okay. So here's one excerpt, from the international from an international statement, that has recognized human security as a more viable approach as opposed to the traditional approach to security. Ang isang sinasabi dito, the constructing of peace begins in our minds as a vision of something new for the future. It should be based on respect for human rights and freedoms and understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial and religious groups. It should condemn the use of war for expansion, aggression, and domination, and the use of force and violence for purposes of repression. So the vision should be linked to action, to real events, and to work for peace, which is taking place around the world. So after our module in national security, we will discuss yung peace education naman, which is closely related to this module. So that's one example of an international agreement or international statement that has recognized the use of human security. How do we define it in the Philippines? The way we define it in the Philippines now, yung usapin ng security is this way, It's a state or condition wherein the people's welfare, well-being, ways of life, government and its institutions, territorial sovereignty, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and core values are enhanced and protected. So we're still using national security, but our approach has expanded, so to include yung wider concept of human security. And so if we look at the 2017 to 2022 national security policy of this administration, diba, makikita natin napakalawak ng kanilang sakop, And this is actually try to I'd like you to access, available naman siya online. Ito yung kopya ng national security policy ng administration na to, for change daw and well-being of the Filipino people. So again, it's quite expansive, right? So you have ito yung mga basic yung policy declarations basis, and these are the challenges. So you have law and order, and administration of justice, internal armed conflicts. So ito yung conventional, traditional approach to national security. Ganun din ito, external environment, right? But you also have other issues of other security issues dito. Pero mapapansin natin na actually merong particular na tuon at particular na focus itong national security policy na ito, So let's look at some of some aspects of this national security policy. There you go. So yan yung ilang issues. So these are the challenges. So yan. Pansinin niyo kung paano nila na frame yung isa sa mga major concerns, challenges na kinakaharap ng Pilipinas. Of course, this was in 2016. They were drafting this in 2016, and this is how they look at the problem. The Philippines has grappled for years with a serious peace and order problem. The national crime rate has posed a significant deterrent to investments, as well as constrained the country's overall development potential. So despite the fact that there is a recognition of expanding the concept of security to including yung wider dimensions of human security, the way a particular administration frames this problem tends towards yung ano pa rin, yung traditional approach, especially this administration. So if you frame your problem that way, then at least meron ka ng idea kung paano nila sasagutin itong problema na ito, right? Take note of this line. The Philippines' growing illegal drugs problem, in particular, needs a determined and proactive solution. So, tingnan, ito yung gusto kong malaman kung nasaan itong mga researches na ito. Successive researches and pertinent crime statistics in the Philippines show a strong and direct correlation between crimes, and drug abuse. So here we notice how the drug problem has been portrayed again as a security and military problem, instead of again looking at it from a health and economic perspective, right? And by economic, hindi yung usapin ng ito yung sinasabi nila na kaya hindi tayo umunlad dahil ang lalalala ng kriminalidad sa Pilipinas. Instead of looking at this problem from a more sociological, political, scientific standpoint, for example. So I encourage you to go over this national security policy. This is available naman online, right? And then of course, it's been 6 years, tama ba? Almost 6 years, and siguro meron na rin tayong idea how this national security policy has been implemented, So let's go back to our discussion. Okay, so that's a 12-point agenda of our of this administration's national security policy. So as you go over that national security policy, if you're interested, you can also go over yung past national security policies like the Benigno Aquino administration or the Ramos administration, right? Or of course, mag-election na ngayon, so next year we'd be expecting another set of policies, right? Economic, security, and other policies, kapag meron ng bagong administrasyon. So if we're looking at their national security policy or this national security policy, these are some of the questions that can help us understand this animal, so to speak. So these questions help us define what security means for this administration or for certain stakeholders. So when we look at security, whose security is it for, right? Security for which values? Again, is it leaning towards a more traditional approach or a more expanded view of security? How much security is enough? What threats are considered major challenges to national security? What means do we use to address these threats? What are the costs? So I hope these questions can help us assess this administration's own national security policy. And here are some of the resources that you can refer to, if you're interested to learn more about this concern. So I think that ends our discussion of the concept of national security. I will give it to your respective facilitators to probe this matter further, if you're interested. Um, and then sila na rin ang bahala doon sa prompt nung inyong journal entry for this topic. But I hope uh, this brief discussion on the concept of national security helped us in a way, in trying to understand our own situation, uh, or our own circumstances. So thank you for listening.